I need shelter tonight." She said it so quietly, he almost didn't hear it over the storm. Standing in his doorway, soaking wet dress torn at the hem, a single bag clutched against her chest like it was the last thing she owned in the world, she didn't beg. She didn't cry. She just looked at him with eyes that had already survived something he didn't yet understand. Wyatt Dawson's hand tightened on the door. His one rule had kept him safe for 11 years. One rule: no strangers, no exceptions. And yet his hand would not close that door. If this story is already pulling at your heart, subscribe to our channel and follow Clara and Wyatt all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The storm came fast that evening, the way Colorado mountain storms always did, without warning, without mercy, and with enough fury to make a grown man grateful for 4 solid walls and a roof that didn't leak. Wyatt Dawson had been out checking the north fence line when the first crack of lightning split the sky open. He brought the horses in, secured the barn door with the iron latch he'd reinforced himself after last winter's windstorm, and was just pulling off his work gloves on the porch when he heard it. A knock. Not loud, not desperate. Just 3 steady raps against the door, the kind a person makes when they've already decided they won't knock a second time, regardless of the answer. He stood still for a moment. Nobody knocked on Wyatt Dawson's door. Not at this hour. Not in this weather. Not without sending word from town first. The people who knew him understood that. The people who didn't know him usually learned quick enough from the ones who did. He opened the door. She was standing at the edge of the porch light, rain coming down hard behind her, her dark hair plastered flat against the sides of her face. She wore a traveling dress that had seen better days. The hem was torn. One shoulder seam had come open and the color had faded to something between brown and exhaustion. She held a single canvas bag against her body with both arms, the way you hold something when it contains everything you have left. She looked at him, he looked at her, and she said it, those 4 words that would quietly, permanently rearrange the architecture of his life. I need shelter tonight. Not a demand, not a manipulation. Just a fact stated plainly by someone who had run out of alternatives and had enough dignity left not to dress it up as something else. Wyatt said nothing for 3 full seconds. In those 3 seconds, every instinct built over 11 years of deliberate solitude told him the same thing: close the door. Politely. Firmly. Tell her there's a town 8 miles south with a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Calloway, and that if she followed the creek road, she'd reach it before midnight, even in this rain. He knew exactly what to say. He had said it before. Twice, in fact, once to a traveling salesman with a broken wagon axle, once to a young drifter with a hard luck story, and eyes that shifted too much when he talked. Both times Wyatt had shut the door without guilt and gone back to his evening. His rule was simple. It wasn't cruel, it was just how things were. Never let strangers stay the night. He looked at her hands. They were trembling. Not from cold, the summer night was warm even with the rain. They were trembling from something else, something that lived deeper than weather. He'd seen that particular kind of trembling before. Once in a mirror, about 11 years ago, standing outside the church where they'd laid his wife and his younger brother in the ground on the same afternoon. He stepped aside. "One night," he said. "At sunrise you leave." She nodded once. Just once. No thank you. No flood of relief. No collapsing into gratitude. She simply walked inside, and Wyatt closed the door against the storm. He pointed her toward the small washroom off the kitchen and told her there were clean towels on the shelf, and a change of clothing his sister Ruth had left some things behind 2 summers ago, and never come back for them, that might fit well enough. He didn't offer more than that. He put a pot of coffee on the stove and sat at the kitchen table and waited, because that was the only sensible thing left to do. She came back out 15 minutes later in a blue cotton dress that was 2 sizes too big in the shoulders and perfectly acceptable everywhere else. She'd wrung out her hair and braided it back from her face. Whatever she'd looked like standing in the rain, broken undone at the mercy of something, that version of her was gone. This version stood at the edge of his kitchen and looked around with clear, observant eyes that missed nothing. He noticed she cataloged the room the way someone does when they're assessing exits. Not paranoid, just careful. "Coffee's on the stove," he said. "Thank you." She poured herself a cup and stood at the counter drinking it. She didn't sit down. She didn't fill the silence with nervous conversation. She just drank the coffee and let the silence be what it was. That surprised him. Most people couldn't survive silence for more than 30 seconds without filling it with something. She seemed perfectly at home in it, which told him that wherever she'd come from, she'd spent considerable time alone. After a while, he said, "Clara." She looked at him. "That's your name, isn't it?" A small pause. "How did you know that? You've got initials burned into your bag, CW. Only one Clara in the valley as far as I know, and she used to teach at the schoolhouse over in Mill Creek until last spring." He picked up his coffee cup. "Clara Whitmore." Something shifted in her expression. Not fear exactly. More like recalculation, the kind of look a person gets when they realize the situation is slightly different than they thought it was. "You know who I am," she said. "I know your name. I know you taught school. I know you left Mill Creek 3 months ago, and nobody in town's been sure where you went." He set his cup down. "I don't know anything else." She looked at him steadily. "Do you want to?" "Not particularly," he said. "You're here for one night. Your business is your own." She nodded slowly, and something in her shoulders relaxed just a fraction, almost imperceptible, but he caught it. "You're not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect? I knocked on 3 doors before yours. The first 2 wouldn't open at all. The third one opened long enough to tell me there was a rancher up the ridge who'd turn me away too, but at least he'd do it to my face." Wyatt looked at her. "Who told you that?" "Old man Teller, down by the creek crossing." Wyatt considered that. "Teller's not wrong about most things." "He was wrong about you." Wyatt didn't answer that. He wasn't sure yet whether she was right. He showed her the small spare room off the back hall. It was clean. Wyatt kept everything clean, not out of hospitality, but out of habit, because disorder made him uneasy in a way he'd never been able to fully articulate. The bed had a quilt on it that his wife Martha had made during their first winter together, blue and cream squares, sewn with the particular care of someone who meant things to last. He hadn't slept in this room. He hadn't let anyone else sleep in it either in all the years since. He stood in the doorway and watched Clara look at the quilt for a moment longer than she looked at anything else. "It's beautiful work," she said quietly. "Go to sleep," he said, and pulled the door shut behind him. He didn't sleep. He lay in his own bed, listening to the rain pound the roof, and thought about his rule and whether he'd made a mistake. Not a moral calculation, just a practical one. A stranger in the house meant a night of light sleeping, one ear tuned to sounds that shouldn't be there. He'd done this twice before, both times during emergencies that left no option, and both times he'd spent the entire night cataloging every creak in the floorboards. Around 2 in the morning, he heard the spare room door open. He was out of bed before the thought fully formed, moving silently down the hall in his socks. The old floorboards memorized well enough to avoid the ones that complained. She was in the kitchen. She hadn't lit a lamp. She was standing at the window with a cup of water in her hands, looking out at the rain, and she startled hard when she heard him in the doorway. Spilled water across her hand, stepped back against the counter. "Sorry," she said immediately. "I didn't think I should have stayed in the room. I'm sorry." "It's all right." He kept his voice level. "Couldn't sleep." She steadied herself. "No." He crossed to the stove, checked the coals, added another piece of wood. "Sit down if you want." She hesitated. Then she sat down at the kitchen table, not in the chair across from where he usually sat, but in the chair at the corner. The observation position, where you could see both the front hall and the back door simultaneously. He pretended not to notice. He made tea this time instead of coffee, because it was 2 in the morning, and he was no longer 25. And he set a cup in front of her without asking if she wanted it. She wrapped both hands around it. "How long have you been on the road?" he asked. She considered how much to say. He could see the calculation happening behind her eyes. 3 days, she finally said. On foot. Mostly. I had a horse until the second day. He didn't ask what happened to the horse. You came from the direction of Telluride. It wasn't a question, but she answered it anyway. Yes. Long way from Mill Creek. I wasn't going back to Mill Creek. He looked at her. Were you going somewhere specific or just away from somewhere? The silence that followed was the longest one yet. The rain had started to ease outside, dropping from a roar to a steady drum against the windows. Away, she said. Just away. Something in the way she said it. The absolute flatness of it. No self-pity, no drama. Just a statement of fact about the geography of desperation made Wyatt feel something he hadn't felt in a long time. Something he would not have been able to name accurately if he tried. He thought of Martha, not the way she looked, just the way she sounded when she talked about her own life before she came west with that same particular flatness that meant the story was real and the person telling it was done pretending otherwise. Get some sleep, he said. Storm'll break by morning. She looked at him. Mr. Dawson. Wyatt. Wyatt. She seemed to test the name briefly, decide it was acceptable. Thank you, not just for tonight, for not asking. He picked up his cup and started back down the hall. Go to sleep, Clara. The storm did not break by morning. It broke by morning in the sense that the rain stopped, the thunder moved east, and the sky went from black to the particular gray that precedes dawn. But what none of them could have known, because the only way to know it was to ride down to the creek crossing and see for yourself, was that the night's rain had done something to the creek bridge. Wyatt rode out at first light to check the north pasture fence the way he did every morning, regardless of weather, and on his way back he swung past the bridge road out of habit. He stopped his horse at the ridge and looked down. The wooden bridge that crossed Dawson Creek, the only road connecting his ranch to the mountain pass that led south toward town, had half its deck planking washed away. What remained was the frame and the two main crossbeams, enough to show you what a bridge used to be, not enough to actually get a horse across. He sat there for a moment. He thought about Clara in his spare room with the blue quilt. He turned his horse around and rode back to the ranch. Yes, she was up when he got back. She'd started a fire in the kitchen stove. She'd found the wood box without being told, and figured out the damper on her own, which was not as simple as it looked, and was standing at the counter with her traveling bag packed and set by the door. Ready to leave. At sunrise, just as he'd said. He pulled off his hat. The bridge is out. She turned to look at him. The creek road, he said. Last night's rain took half the deck. There's no way across. She was quiet for a moment. Then, how long to repair it? Depends on whether I can get timber up here in this weather. 3 days at the fastest. Could be a week. He watched her process this. Watched her come to terms with a situation she had absolutely no control over in the home of a man she'd known for approximately 8 hours, with nowhere else to go, and a packed bag already in her hand. She set the bag back down. I'll stay out of your way, she said. It's not a large house. No. She looked at the stove, the coffee pot, the kitchen she'd started putting to use without being asked. It's not. Wyatt hung up his hat. There's eggs in the coop, milk's in the cold cellar. If you're going to be here, you might as well eat. I'll earn it, she said immediately. Not defensive, just clear. He looked at her for a moment. Nobody said you wouldn't. He went back outside to start the morning work, and behind him, for the first time in more years than he could exactly count, there was the sound of someone moving around in his kitchen like they had a right to be there. By noon of that first full day, Wyatt had a problem he hadn't anticipated. He kept noticing her. Not in the way that made him uncomfortable, nothing like that. Just in the way you notice something that surprises you. He'd come in from the barn at mid-morning for a tool he'd forgotten, and she was in the back hallway, sorting through a pile of clothes he'd been meaning to mend for months, doing it with the quiet efficiency of someone who simply saw what needed to be done and did it. She didn't announce herself. She didn't wait for permission. She just worked. He went back outside with his tool and stood in the yard for a moment longer than he needed to. He'd had hired hands before, two of them over the years. Both men. Both decent workers who did what they were told and stayed out of his business and eventually moved on to somewhere that offered more human company than Wyatt's ranch provided. Neither one of them had ever made him stand in his own yard with a wrench in his hand, wondering what he was thinking. He went back to the fence. At noon, she rang the triangle bell on the porch post. He hadn't rung that bell in years, hadn't even thought about it, but apparently she'd noticed it and decided it was there for a reason. He came in from the south field, genuinely uncertain what he was about to walk into. She'd made lunch from what was in his kitchen: cornbread, salt pork, dried beans, cooked down with some herbs she'd found in the garden that he'd been ignoring since spring. It was the kind of meal that required someone to actually look at the ingredients and think about what they could become together, rather than just cooking them separately. He sat down at the table. He ate. He didn't say anything for a long moment. "You had time going to seat out by the fence post," she said, sitting across from him with her own plate, and sage, and what looks like it might have been a rosemary bush before it decided to just grow however it wanted. "My wife planted those." The table went quiet. Clara looked at him directly, not with the flinching pity he'd gotten used to from people who knew about Martha, not with the awkward half-apology that usually followed. Just with steady, clear eyes that acknowledged what he'd said and waited to see if he wanted to say more. He didn't. "The time's still good," she said. "It takes care of itself." Something about that sentence sat with him the rest of the afternoon, in a way he couldn't explain and didn't try to. On the second day he caught her in the barn. Not doing anything alarming, she was brushing down his bay mare Patience with a confidence that told him immediately she hadn't learned horses recently. Patience was particular about strangers. She'd bitten a man in town last spring for reaching toward her face too fast. She was currently standing with her head dropped and her lower lip slack, which was as close to bliss as Patience ever got. "Where'd you learn horses?" he said from the doorway. Clara didn't stop brushing. "My father had 3. I learned before I learned to walk, more or less." "Your father was a rancher." "Farmer. Small spread outside Mill Creek. He died 14 months ago." He came into the barn and checked on the 2 geldings in the far stalls. "I'm sorry," he said. "He lived the life he wanted to live," she said. "That's more than most people can say." He looked over at her. "You sound like you believe that." "I do." She moved the brush in long strokes down Patience's neck. "I just wish it had been longer." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "What happened to the property after he died?" Her hand stilled on the brush. Just for a second. Just long enough for him to notice. "It's being handled," she said. The flatness was back. The same flatness from the kitchen at 2 in the morning. The geography of something she'd been trying to get away from. He didn't push. He went back to checking the geldings. But he filed it away, the way you file away the details that don't add up yet, because sometimes the picture only becomes clear when you've seen all the pieces. That evening, he was mending harness leather on the porch when she came out and sat down in the other chair, the one that had been empty for years, and brought her mending with her. She had the shirts from the hallway pile and a needle and thread from somewhere, and she set about working while the light lasted. They sat like that for an hour, working, not talking. 2 people in chairs on a porch in the Colorado mountain evening, with the smell of rain-washed grass and the sound of nighthawks starting up in the distance. He didn't know when it stopped feeling strange. He just knew that at some point it did. "You're not what people think you are," she said finally. He glanced over. "What do people think I am?" "The man at the general store in Mill Creek, Mr. Purvis. He said you were the most disagreeable rancher in the whole county. Said you'd argue with your own shadow if it fell the wrong direction." Wyatt made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Purvis sold me a broke plow blade and charged me full price. I disagreed with that." He said you told him he should be ashamed of himself in front of the whole store. I said he should be ashamed of himself and give me a refund. He gave me the refund. He turned back to the harness. I stand by it. Clara was smiling. He could hear it in the brief pause before she spoke again. He also said you repaired Tom Elder's barn roof last winter and refused to let Tom pay you. Tom Elder's got 8 children and a sick wife and a barn that was one windstorm from coming down on his livestock. It needed to be done. That's not the action of a disagreeable man. Wyatt pulled the leather tight and checked his work. I'm disagreeable when someone gives me reason. I'm not disagreeable for the pleasure of it. She was quiet for a moment. Most people who are mean for pleasure think they have reasons too. He looked over at her. She was looking at him back with those clear, direct eyes, not challenging, just observing, making a distinction she thought was important enough to state out loud. He thought about a man he'd heard of secondhand from the circuit judge who came through the valley twice a year. A businessman out of Denver, someone said, who made his money finding legal angles on property that recently lost its primary owner. Widows, orphans, people who didn't know the law well enough to know when someone was using it against them. He thought about Clara's father's property. He thought about the flatness in her voice when she said it's being handled. He picked up his harness and kept working. On the 3rd day, a rider came up the mountain road. Not from the direction of town, from the north, which meant he'd come around through the high pass rather than across the bridge road. The kind of route a man takes when he doesn't want anyone in town to know he's heading to Wyatt Dawson's ranch. Wyatt was splitting wood in the yard when the rider appeared at the top of the rise. He set his axe down and stood with his hands at his sides and watched the man come down. He was well dressed for a mountain road. That was the first thing you noticed. Everything about him, the horse, the coat, the set of his jaw, said money and meant for you to know it. He stopped his horse in Wyatt's yard and looked down with a smile that didn't involve his eyes. Mr. Dawson. He had the voice of a man accustomed to rooms where people stopped talking when he entered. My name is Henry Caldwell. I believe you've had a house guest for the last few days. Wyatt didn't move. My business is my own, Mr. Caldwell. Henry Caldwell glanced toward the house. I've been looking for a woman named Clara Whitmore. She's, well, there's no delicate way to put this. She's taken something that doesn't belong to her, and she's caused a good deal of difficulty for a number of people who trusted her. The kitchen window was directly behind Henry Caldwell's left shoulder. Wyatt did not look at the window. I don't know any Clara Whitmore, he said. Henry Caldwell smiled again. Mr. Dawson, I have 3 men in town who'll tell you a woman matching her description was seen on the road to your ranch 4 days ago. I'm not trying to cause trouble. I just want what's mine. If you've got claims to make, Wyatt said, the territorial court in Silverton handles that kind of business. 3 days south Good Road. I'm not interested in courts at the moment. The smile dropped. I'm interested in a conversation, with you and your house guest both. Wyatt picked up his axe. Not in a threatening way. Just picked it up the way you pick up a tool when you have work to do, and you're nearly done with this conversation. Come back when the creek road's repaired, he said. I'll give you the same answer then. Henry Caldwell looked at him for a long moment. The money in his horse and his coat didn't change anything about Wyatt's yard or Wyatt's axe or Wyatt's expression. After a moment, he turned the horse around and rode back up the rise. Wyatt stood in the yard until the rider was out of sight. Then he walked to the house, came through the back door into the kitchen, and found Clara standing at the counter with both hands flat on the surface and her face the color of old ash. She'd seen him from the window. She'd heard enough. Clara, he said. She looked at him. For the first time since she'd arrived, her composure had come completely undone. Not crying, nothing like that. Just undone. The scaffolding was down. He found me, she said. Not yet, Wyatt said. He knows you were on this road. He doesn't know you're here. He knows. Her voice was very quiet. He always knows. Wyatt pulled out a chair. Sit down, he said. And tell me who Henry Caldwell is. She sat down, and she told him. There, It took her a long time to tell it, and she told it without flinching, in the same straight-ahead way she did everything else. But underneath the level voice, Wyatt could hear what it had cost her not to live through it, but to say it out loud to someone she'd known for 3 days. Her father had been sick for the last 2 years of his life. Not dying. Sick, not at first. Just the slow kind of diminishment that changes. A man takes things from him a little at a time. His memory went first. Then his judgment about certain things. Not everything he could still work. The land still knew every inch of the property, but his ability to read the fine print of a legal document, to understand what he was signing when someone put papers in front of him and explained them in a way that sounded simple and safe. Henry Caldwell had appeared the year before her father died, dressed in the same expensive coat, with the same smile that didn't reach his eyes. He called himself a land investment manager. He told her father he could secure the property, set up a legal arrangement that would protect it in the event of his death. Make sure Clara was taken care of. Her father had trusted him. He shouldn't have. The papers he signed, Clara had read them after, with a lawyer's help. The lawyer 2 towns over, who charged her the last of her savings, to explain what she was looking at. The papers didn't protect the property. They transferred control of it. Not the title, not yet, but the operational authority. The right to manage, lease, negotiate, act on behalf of the estate. In other words, they gave Henry Caldwell the legal authority to do whatever he wanted with her father's land, as long as he could argue he was acting in the estate's interest. And he had been. In his own interest. He's been leasing parcels to a mining company out of Denver, Clara said. Her hands were flat on the table now, very still. At a fraction of their value, he gets a percentage from the mining company on the side. He's been systematically draining the estate of assets and calling it estate management. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. And the original deed, the title to the land, my father never signed that over. The title is still in the Whitmore name. But Caldwell has 3 lawyers working to convert the management agreement into a transfer of title. She looked at him. If that happens, the property is legally his, and I have no claim. What do you have? She hesitated, just for a second. Then she reached into the traveling bag that had been sitting by the back door and pulled out a folded oilcloth envelope, the kind you use when you need to protect papers from weather. She set it on the table. The original documents, she said. The ones my father signed, and the correspondence between Caldwell and the mining company. I found it in his office in Telluride. She looked at Wyatt steadily. He doesn't know I have it. He thinks I ran because I was afraid. He doesn't know what I took with me. Wyatt looked at the oilcloth envelope. He looked at Clara. He thought about Henry Caldwell in his yard with his expensive coat and his eyes that didn't match his smile, talking about a woman who had taken something that didn't belong to her. He's not looking for you, Wyatt said slowly. He's looking for those documents. Clara looked at him. Yes, she said. He is. Outside, the wind moved through the empty yard where Henry Caldwell's horse had stood an hour earlier, and in the kitchen of a ranch that had been silent for 11 years, 2 people sat across a table from each other with an oilcloth envelope between them and a problem that was about to get considerably more complicated. Wyatt pulled the envelope toward him. "Show me what you've got," he said. She opened the envelope and spread the papers on the table and began to explain, and for the first time since her father had put his name on a document he didn't understand, someone was listening with the focused, patient attention of a man who intended to do something about what he heard. The storm outside had passed. A different kind was just beginning. The papers told a story that made Wyatt's jaw tighten. Not because it was complicated, because it wasn't. The complexity was the disguised layers of legal language designed to make a simple theft look like a service to make a man signing away his legacy feel like he was being taken care of. Wyatt had spent 11 years alone on this ranch, but he hadn't spent them ignorant. He dealt with land agents, timber contracts, water rights disputes. He knew what legitimate paperwork looked like. This wasn't it. This clause here, he said, pressing his finger to a line near the bottom of the third page. This gives him authority to execute binding agreements on behalf of the estate without requiring your counter-signature. I know, Clara said. Your father signed this thinking it was a protection clause. The man who explained it to him called it a continuity provision, said it meant the property would keep running smoothly if my father had a bad spell and couldn't make decisions for a period. Her voice was level, controlled. The way a person's voice gets when they've been angry about something for so long that the anger has settled down into something colder and more permanent. My father thought he was planning ahead. He thought he was protecting me. Wyatt looked up from the papers. He was trying to. He was dying, and he was scared, and someone handed him a pin at exactly the right moment. She met his eyes. That's all it takes. Wyatt sat back. He looked at the correspondence next the letters between Caldwell and a Denver company called Mountain Pacific Resources. The numbers in those letters were the clearest part of the whole picture. Parcels of Whitmore land leased to Mountain Pacific for mining exploration at rates that were, by Wyatt's rough estimate, somewhere between a third and a half of what those parcels were actually worth. And in a separate column of figures, handwritten in a different ink, a percentage paid to a private account in Denver with Caldwell's initials beside it, side payments, for favorable terms. He's been at this for over a year, Wyatt said. 14 months. And you've been building this case the whole time. Clara looked at him steadily. Since the week after the funeral, yes. He thought about that. A 27-year-old woman fresh from burying her father sitting across from a lawyer who charged her the last of her savings, learning the exact shape of how she'd been robbed. Not falling apart. Building a case. You went to his office in Telluride yourself, he said, to get these. I knew where he kept the correspondence. He had a standing meeting with the Denver people the third Thursday of every month. I had a 4-hour window. That was a considerable risk. Yes, she said simply. It was. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind had died completely. The night was still and dark, and the ranch sat in the middle of it the way it always did, solid, isolated, indifferent to the lives being sorted out inside its walls. He knows you took them, Wyatt said. He didn't know immediately, but by now... She paused. By now he's opened that drawer and found it empty, and yes, he knows. Which is why he came up the mountain road today. Wyatt folded the papers back into the oilcloth envelope with careful hands. He smoothed the flap down and slid it across the table toward her. These stay with you. Not in the bag on your person, day and night. She picked up the envelope without argument. I know. How many people know you have them? One lawyer in Glenwood Springs. He's the one who explained what I was looking at. A pause. And now you. Wyatt stood up from the table. He moved to the window and stood there without looking out, just standing with his back to her, thinking in the particular quiet way he had that she was already beginning to recognize. Not absence, just processing. In the morning, he said, I'm going to ride into Mill Creek and talk to Judge Alderman. She went very still. Wyatt. He's a territorial judge with federal connections. If these documents are what they look like, they are. Then Alderman's the right man. He turned around. He doesn't know Caldwell. More important, Caldwell doesn't own him. Clara was looking at him with an expression he couldn't completely read. Part of it was relief, the kind that arrives before you're ready for it, before you've allowed yourself to believe it's real, and so sits uneasily on a face still braced for the next blow. But underneath that was something else, something that looked almost like suspicion. Why? She said. He frowned slightly. Why what? Why are you doing this? I arrived at your door 3 days ago. You didn't know me. You had every reason to turn me away, and none whatsoever to get involved in this. She held his gaze. So why? Wyatt was quiet for a moment. Not because he didn't have an answer. Because the answer was more complicated than he generally allowed himself to examine. Because what's being done to you is wrong, he said. And I'm not willing to watch a wrong thing happen when I have the means to do something about it. That's an answer about justice, she said. I'm asking about you. The kitchen was very quiet. Go to sleep, Clara, he said. I'll ride out at first light. He went down the hall to his own room, and he lay down, and for the second time in 3 nights, he didn't sleep. He was gone before she woke. She found the coffee already made. He'd built the stove fire before he left, which meant he'd been up at 4 in the morning doing it, and a note on the kitchen table, written in the plain, direct handwriting of a man who didn't waste words on paper any more than he did in person. Back by midday. Don't open the door for anyone. W. She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in her dress pocket, which was not a thing she examined the reason for doing. She fed the animals. She knew where everything was by now. 3 days in this place had taught her its rhythms the way you learn a song, not all at once, but by listening for the pattern. The horses needed water first, then feed. The 2 milk cows in the south pen were easier if you talked to them while you worked. The chickens were completely unreasonable at all times, and the best approach was simply to accept that and move through them quickly. She worked through the morning. She tried not to think about Henry Caldwell on a mountain road in an expensive coat. She mostly failed. Around 10 o'clock, she was in the garden pulling weeds from around the herb beds she'd been slowly reclaiming from the surrounding chaos, because it was work that kept her hands busy and her mind from going places she couldn't afford to go when she heard a sound from the direction of the front road. Not a horse. She went still. It was a wagon. She could hear the axle creak, the particular sound of a loaded wagon coming down a grade. She straightened up and listened, and after a moment she heard it stop in front of the house. Then voices. 2 of them. She didn't recognize either. She went in the back door and stood in the kitchen and listened through the front wall. A knock. She didn't move. Another knock louder. Then a woman's voice. Hello, Mr. Dawson. It's Patricia Harmon from down the valley. I've got my boy with me. We're looking for help if Mr. Dawson's available. Clara stood in the kitchen. She thought about the note. Don't open the door for anyone. She thought about Wyatt quietly rebuilding Tom Elder's barn roof in January. She went to the front door and opened it. The woman on the porch was maybe 60, weathered in the way that spoke of 40 years of outdoor work, with honest eyes and hands that matched her face. Beside her was a boy of about 12, with his left arm wrapped in a cloth sling that had clearly been improvised in a hurry from what looked like a curtain panel. Oh, the woman said plainly, surprised to find someone other than Wyatt at the door. I'm sorry I was looking for you. I'm a guest of Mr. Dawson's, Clara said. He's not here at the moment. Is the boy hurt? He fell from the roof of the equipment shed trying to fix a loose shingle and came down hard on his shoulder. I don't think it's broken, but it needs proper tending, and my wagon can't make the bridge road, so I thought Wyatt Dawson was always... She stopped. I'm sorry I don't know you. My name is Clara. Come inside. By the time Wyatt rode back into the yard at 11:30, the wagon was still there. He came through the front door to find Clara at the kitchen table with the boy's arm laid out in front of her, binding a proper split to his shoulder with strips of clean cloth she'd found in the supply chest, while the boy's grandmother sat in the corner chair doing her best to look calm and mostly succeeding. Wyatt stood in the doorway and looked at the scene. Fell from a roof, Clara said without looking up from her work. Shoulders out of socket. I put it back. He needs to keep it still for at least 2 weeks and stay off ladders. She tied the last knot. This is Mrs. Harmon and her grandson. She said you'd know her. Patricia. Wyatt took his hat off. How'd this happen? The usual way, the old woman said. He's 12 and thought he knew better than the shed. The shed's been needing that shingle fixed since September, the boy said, with the particular injured dignity of someone who has done a foolish thing for a legitimate reason. Somebody had to do it. Somebody could have waited for Mr. Dawson to come around and help. Patricia said. I'm going to come around tomorrow and do the shingle properly, Wyatt said. How's the rest of the roof? Manageable. He crossed to look at Clara's work on the boy's arm, leaned over, examined the binding, checked the angle of the splint. Clara had done this before. The work was clean and confident, exactly the right tension, exactly the right position. Where'd you learn to do this? He asked. My mother, she said. She was the closest thing Mill Creek had to a doctor for about 15 years. Wyatt looked at her. She met his eyes briefly, then looked back at her patient. Can you move your fingers? She asked the boy. He wiggled them. Yes, ma'am. Good. That'll do for now. She stepped back, wiped her hands on a clean rag. He should see a real doctor when the road's clear. But he'll be all right until then. Patricia Harmon had been watching Clara with the focused, assessing look of a woman who had spent 60 years accurately reading the people who passed through her life. She said, You're the Whitmore girl, from Mill Creek. Clara went still for just a second. I am, she said. Your mother tended my husband when he broke his collarbone in '68. Sat with him 3 days until the fever broke. Patricia looked at her steadily. You look like her. People say that. She was a good woman. Patricia stood up and straightened her skirt. There's been a man asking about you in town. Came in yesterday, well-dressed, too smooth for these roads. Said you'd stolen something from him. The kitchen went very quiet. Wyatt was watching Clara. Clara was looking at Patricia Harmon with the stillness of someone deciding how much to say to someone they've known for 10 minutes. What did people say? Clara asked. Different things. Patricia picked up her hat from the chair back. But Tom Elder's wife said that if the Whitmore girl was in trouble, she doubted very much it was of her own making. And Tom Elder himself said that if the man with the smooth coat wanted to find her, Tom didn't know where she was and didn't care to guess. She put her hat on. Mill Creek knew your father. That counts for something. Clara looked at the table for a moment. When she looked up, her expression had shifted. Something in it opened slightly, the way a window opens when the pressure inside and outside finally equalizes. Thank you, she said quietly, for telling me that. Thank you for tending my grandson. Patricia gathered the boy with the efficiency of a woman who has been moving reluctant children in the right direction for decades. Mr. Dawson, come do that shingle tomorrow if you can. I'll be there by 8, Wyatt said. He walked them out. When he came back inside, Clara was standing at the sink, washing her hands, her back to the room. Caldwell was in town yesterday, she said. She wasn't asking. Yes. He's telling people I stole from him. Patricia Harmon doesn't believe him. Tom Elder doesn't believe him. Wyatt came to the table and sat down. How many other people in Mill Creek knew your father? She turned to look at him. Most of them. He lived there 30 years. Then Caldwell's working against himself. The more he talks, the more people who knew Daniel Whitmore are going to start asking questions about a man they've never seen who's claiming his daughter is a thief. Something moved through her expression, not hope exactly, but the first distant cousin of it. You talk to Judge Alderman. He'll ride up when the road clears. He wants to see the documents. Wyatt paused. He also said something I think you need to hear. She waited. He said this isn't the first time he's seen Caldwell's name on a complaint. There's a case out of Gunnison County, a widow land similar to your father's, same kind of management agreement. The case was dropped before it went to court. He looked at her carefully. The widow withdrew her complaint. Clara was very still. Why, Alderman didn't know, or didn't say. He held her gaze. But it means Caldwell's done this before, and it means he's capable of making people change their minds about going forward. The color had drained slightly from her face, but her jaw was set in a way that Wyatt was starting to recognize. The look that appeared when she was afraid and had decided that fear was not going to be the thing that made her decisions. He won't change my mind, she said. I know, Wyatt said. I'm telling you so you're not surprised if he tries. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she went to the stove and picked up the coffee pot, filled his cup without asking, and sat down across from him. "What did he say to you?" she asked. "When he came to the yard yesterday. All of it." Wyatt told her. She listened without interrupting, which was something he was learning was characteristic of her. She listened the way she worked, with full attention, not waiting for her turn to speak, but actually absorbing what was being said. When he finished, she sat with it for a moment. "He called me dishonest," she said. "He implied it. He'll do more than imply it." She turned her cup between her hands. "He'll build a story. He's good at that, taking the shape of a true thing and filling it with something false. He'll say I was unstable after my father's death, that I made accusations against him out of grief and confusion, that the documents I took were ones he had a right to as estate manager, and I removed them illegally." She looked at Wyatt steadily. "And the problem is, if you read only his version of events, none of it is obviously wrong, except the correspondence with Mountain Pacific." "Except that." Her eyes sharpened. "Which is why he wants it back. Without that correspondence, the side payments are invisible. The management agreement looks like exactly what he told my father it was. A legitimate estate arrangement that an unstable daughter is now contesting out of grief." Wyatt leaned forward. "Then we make sure that correspondence reaches Alderman before Caldwell has time to construct his version. And if Caldwell gets to Alderman first..." "Alderman's been on the territorial bench for 18 years. He's had smoother men than Caldwell try to build stories for him." He paused. "He's not perfect, but he's not bought." She absorbed that. "Then, you trust him." "I trust him the way I trust a good tool. It does what it's built for as long as you use it right." The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the shape one might take if the circumstances were slightly different. "That's a very specific kind of trust." "It's the only kind worth having." They sat at the table while the afternoon moved past the windows, and outside Wyatt's ranch went about the business of an ordinary Thursday. The horses in the south field, the chickens being unreasonable, the herb garden slowly recovering from years of neglect, and inside, two people who had known each other for 4 days talked about legal strategy with the focused practicality of people who had no room left for anything less than the truth. On the 4th day, Wyatt came in from the north pasture at mid-morning to find Clara in his barn and not brushing horses. She was on her knees in the far corner, one of his gelding's front legs cradled in her lap, working something out of the frog of his hoof with a pick. The horse Clement, who was 14 years old and had an opinion about everything, was standing perfectly still, which was not his normal state of being when someone was working on his feet. "He's been favoring that leg since yesterday," she said without looking up. "Stone bruise, I think. I found some packed gravel in here." She held up the pick with a small, jagged piece of shale on the end of it. "That'll do it." Wyatt crouched down to look. The frog was tender but not infected. She'd cleaned it out cleanly and was already applying a light poultice from somewhere. "Where'd you get that?" he asked, nodding at the poultice. "Your supply chest. You had comfrey root and beeswax. It's basic, but it'll draw out the bruising." She set Clement's foot down gently. The horse turned his head and looked at her with an expression of cautious appreciation. "He should be fine in a few days if you keep him off hard ground." Wyatt stood up. He looked at Clara getting to her feet, brushing straw from her knees, matter-of-fact, and unhurried, like tending a favored horse's stone bruise on a weekday morning was simply the next thing that needed doing. "You were a school teacher," he said. "I was." She moved to the water bucket and washed her hands. "Before that, you were apparently a doctor, a veterinarian, and a cook." She glanced over her shoulder. "My father's farm wasn't large enough to hire specialists." She dried her hands on the work cloth hanging on the post. "You did what needed doing." "You do a lot of things that need doing." "So do you." He wasn't sure what to say to that, so he didn't say anything. He checked on Clement himself, ran a hand down the leg she'd treated, confirmed what she'd said. Then he went to hang up the fence tool he'd carried in with him, and when he turned around, she was still standing there, looking at him with an expression that was different from any expression she'd worn in the 4 days he'd known her. "What?" he said. She shook her head slightly, as if deciding against whatever she'd been about to say. Then she changed her mind. "When I knocked on your door that night," she said, "I had already been turned away twice. I was wet and exhausted, and I'd been walking since morning, and I had an envelope full of stolen evidence under my arm, and a man with lawyers looking for me." She looked at him steadily. "I knocked on your door because it was the last door on this road, not because I thought you'd say yes." He waited. "You said yes," she said. "And then you stepped aside before I could say thank you, and then you made coffee." Something shifted in her expression, not fragility, more like the controlled acknowledgement of something that had cost her. It's been a long time since someone just stepped aside and made coffee." Wyatt was quiet. He could feel the weight of what she was really saying underneath the words she'd chosen, the way you feel pressure before weather, not yet seeing the storm, but knowing it's there. He understood the particular exhaustion of being a person who handled everything themselves because they'd learned there was no one else to handle it. He'd lived in that country for 11 years. "The coffee was for me, too," he said. "I hadn't slept." She let out a sound that was almost a laugh. "I know. You had the look of a man who'd been trying to talk himself out of a decision he'd already made. Had I succeeded, you'd have slept in the creek road. I'd have managed." "I know," he said. "That's not the point." She looked at him. He picked up the fence tool and walked out of the barn because there were about 4 different things trying to work their way up through his chest, and he wasn't ready for any of them. That afternoon, something changed. Not dramatically, not with a single event. It happened the way most real things happen, gradually accumulating, until it became impossible to ignore. Wyatt came back from checking the south fence to find that Clara had rearranged the supply room off the kitchen, not moved things to different places, arbitrarily organized them. What had been a general collection of tools, stores, and equipment, lumped together by year of arrival, now had a logic to it. Medicines and poultice supplies separated from food stores. Hardware in one section, household goods in another. Everything labeled in her clear, steady handwriting on small cards she'd made from paper she'd asked him about that morning. He stood in the supply room doorway for a moment. It had taken her most of the afternoon. She'd done it without announcing her intention or asking whether he minded, which was exactly how he himself would have approached a task that clearly needed doing. He didn't say anything about it at supper, but he noticed. And at supper she made something from dried apples and the last of the flour that was technically a pie, in the same way that technically the sun rises every morning, factually accurate and also slightly miraculous given what she'd had to work with. Wyatt ate most of it and said nothing, which was the highest compliment he knew how to pay. "Tell me about your wife," she said. He set his fork down. She looked at him without apology. "You don't have to. But you have photographs on the mantel and a quilt on the spare bed and herbs in the garden that have been growing on their own for what looks like years. And you carry her the way some men carry something too heavy to put down and too important to drop." She met his eyes. "I'm not prying. I'm asking because I'd like to know who she was." It was the most direct thing anyone had said to him about Martha in years. Most people avoided the subject with the careful navigation of someone walking around a hole in the ground, which he'd always found more exhausting than simply saying the thing. "Her name was Martha," he said. "She was from Ohio originally. She came west with her family when she was 16 and ended up in Colorado because her uncle had a mining claim near Telluride." He was quiet for a moment. "She was the smartest person I ever met. She read everything she could get her hands on. She'd argue with you about anything if she thought you were wrong, and she was usually right, which was occasionally aggravating. Clara was listening in the way she listened fully without performance. She died in the spring of '67, he said. Wagon accident. Her brother Daniel was with her. He was 23. He picked up his coffee cup. I built most of what's on this ranch after that because I needed something to do with my hands. 11 years, she said softly. 11 years. The silence between them was different from the silences they'd had before. Those had been the comfortable quiet of two people who didn't need noise to fill the space. This one was different, more aware of itself, more conscious of the two people sitting inside it. "I'm sorry," she said. "Not the way people say it because they don't know what else to say. I mean it. She sounds like someone worth missing." Wyatt looked at her for a moment. She was. He stood up and started clearing the table, and Clara stood to help, and they moved around each other in the kitchen with the unconscious coordination of people who have been sharing a space long enough to stop negotiating it. He was handing her the cleaned pot to dry when he said without planning to, "Your father. What was he like?" She went still for just a second. Then she took the pot and dried it and said, "He was a quiet man, the serious kind who tells a joke so rarely that when he does you laugh twice as hard because you weren't expecting it." She put the pot on its shelf. He knew the name of every plant on his land. Not just what they were, what they meant. Which ones came back after drought? Which ones were first after frost? She paused. He said the land remembered things that people forgot. Wyatt hung up the dishcloth. He wasn't wrong. No. Her voice was soft. He wasn't wrong about much. They finished cleaning the kitchen in silence. Outside, the evening insects were starting up. The horses were settled. The ranch was doing what it did every night, going still around its edges, while the center of it, the house, held what warmth was left from the day. Wyatt banked the stove for the night. Clara picked up her lamp from the table. She paused at the hallway door. "Wyatt?" He looked at her. "When Alderman comes," she said, "and when this goes to court, and it will go to court whatever Caldwell does between now and then, I want you to know that I'm not afraid of the fight. I'm afraid of what happens if I fight and lose." She held his gaze. "That's the only thing I'm afraid of." He looked at her for a long moment. The lamplight was in her face, and in it he could see something he recognized, not Martha, not the past, but the particular quality of a person who has been carrying something alone for so long that they've stopped expecting anyone else to know the weight of it. "You won't fight alone," he said. "That's all I can tell you tonight." She looked at him, just looked at him with those clear eyes that took the measure of things, and then she nodded once, the same way she'd nodded when he told her she could stay one night. The nod of a person who is taking what's offered and not demanding more. She went to her room. Wyatt stood at the banked stove and listened to the sound of a door closing softly down the hall. And he thought about a rule he'd made 11 years ago, and whether the man who made it had been trying to protect himself or simply trying to survive. He thought about the difference. He blew out the kitchen lamp and stood in the dark for a moment. Outside, a coyote called once from somewhere up the ridge, and then the ranch was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet than it had been a week ago. Less empty. More like the quiet that comes before something is said. The pause that belongs to people who are still deciding how much of the truth they're ready to give each other. He went to bed. Somewhere in the house, a clock ticked steadily, and the next morning, Henry Caldwell came back with a different approach, and a different man beside him, and the bridge road Wyatt noticed as he stood on the porch, watching the two riders come down through the early light, had just enough of its deck repaired to let a careful horse through. The few days of grace were over. Henry Caldwell did not come alone this time. The man beside him on the second horse was younger, mid-30s, clean-shaved, wearing a coat that was slightly less expensive than Caldwell's, but cut from the same philosophy. He had a leather satchel across his saddle horn, and the practiced, neutral expression of a man who spent his professional life in rooms where other people argued. A lawyer. Wyatt knew the type before the man opened his mouth. Wyatt was standing on his porch with his coffee cup when they came down through the early light. He didn't move toward them, and he didn't step back. He just stood there and let them come the way you let weather come when there's nothing left to do about it. "Mr. Dawson." Caldwell pulled his horse up at the yard's edge, not quite far enough to be respectful, not quite close enough to be threatening. He had the calculations of a man who knew exactly what every distance meant. "I appreciate you not shutting the door on us." "I'm on my porch," Wyatt said. "I haven't opened a door." The lawyer's expression remained neutral. Caldwell's flickered just slightly, just enough. "This is Mr. Raymond Fitch," Caldwell said. "He's an attorney representing my interests in the matter of—" "I know what he is," Wyatt said. "Say what you came to say." Fitch reached into his satchel and produced a folded document. He didn't hand it over, just held it visible the way you hold evidence when you want someone to know you have it before you explain what it is. "Mr. Dawson," Fitch said. His voice was carefully modulated, professionally calm. "My client has reason to believe that a woman named Clara Whitmore is currently on your property. Miss Whitmore is in possession of documents belonging to the Whitmore estate, which is currently under the legal management of Mr. Caldwell, pursuant to an agreement executed in good faith with the late Daniel Whitmore." He paused. "We are not here to cause difficulty. We are here to recover property and to give Miss Whitmore the opportunity to resolve this matter privately, rather than through the courts." "Privately," Wyatt said. "There's no need for this to become a public legal matter," Fitch said. "Mr. Caldwell is prepared to be generous. Miss Whitmore returns the documents, withdraws any complaints she may be intending to file, and Mr. Caldwell will relinquish his management interest in the estate. The land returns to her clear." Wyatt looked at Caldwell. Caldwell looked back at him with the careful pleasantness of a man who has made this kind of offer before and knows exactly what it is. Not generosity, but arithmetic. The cost of a clean exit versus the cost of a fight. "Clara," Wyatt said without turning his head. The front door opened behind him. She stepped out onto the porch and stood beside him, and Wyatt felt rather than saw the exact moment Caldwell's eyes found her, felt the shift in the air, the recalibration. Because she wasn't what Caldwell had come expecting. She wasn't frightened. She wasn't disheveled. She was standing straight in the Colorado morning light, with her hands at her sides and her eyes on Caldwell, with an expression that was the absolute opposite of the woman who had knocked on a stranger's door in the rain 5 days ago. "Henry," she said. Just that. His name, flat and clear and without fear. Something moved through Caldwell's face, just briefly, something that was not quite what he'd planned for. "Clara." He adjusted. The pleasant voice came back. "I'm glad you're safe. I've been worried about you. After everything that happened with your father running off the way you did, I was concerned." "I'm sure you were," she said. "Mr. Fitch has outlined a very fair resolution. I think if you consider it clearly, you want the correspondence back," she said. "The letters between you and Mountain Pacific Resources, the ones that document the side payments you received for leasing my father's land at below market rates." The pleasant expression stayed on Caldwell's face, but it took visible effort now. "Those letters," he said carefully, "are estate documents that were removed from my office without authorization. They're evidence," she said, "of fraud." Fitch spoke. "That is a serious allegation, Miss Whitmore, and one that would require substantiation in—" "I have the substantiation," she said. "In writing, with your client's initials on it." A silence settled over the yard. Wyatt stood in it and felt the shape of the thing. Caldwell had come up the mountain road with a lawyer and a settlement offer, which meant he was trying to close the case before it opened. Men who came with settlement offers were men who knew what a case looked like from the inside. Men who had something to lose. "The offer," Fitch said, recovering, "remains available. 30 days to consider." "No," Clara said. Fitch blinked. "Miss Whitmore." "I said no." Her voice was the same controlled level instrument it always was, but underneath it was something harder than Wyatt had heard before. "You came up here because you needed those documents back before Judge Alderman sees them. That's the only reason there's a settlement offer. Because without those letters you have a case. With them, you have a problem." She looked at Caldwell directly. "I'm not giving them back. I'm not withdrawing anything. And I'm not settling." Caldwell let the pleasant expression go. What was underneath it was quieter and considerably more dangerous. "You're making a mistake," he said. "Not a threat exactly, more like a weather report. I have 3 lawyers, a Denver judge who reviews territorial cases, and 14 months of documented estate management that will hold up to any scrutiny Alderman cares to apply. What you have is a folder of correspondence that a good lawyer can argue you stole and misrepresented." His eyes moved to Wyatt. "And a rancher who let you in out of the rain and doesn't fully understand what he's standing in the middle of. Wyatt set his coffee cup down on the porch rail. "I understand it fine," he said. "You dressed up a theft in legal language and sold it to a dying man who trusted you. You've been paid twice, once by the estate you were supposed to protect, and once by the company you were supposed to be negotiating against." He held Caldwell's gaze. "The only thing I don't understand is how you look at yourself in the morning." The yard was very quiet. Caldwell looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Fitch. Something passed between them, the silent recalculation of men who have encountered unexpected resistance and are determining their next move. "Mr. Dawson," Fitch set his voice back to professional neutral. "You should understand that harboring Miss Whitmore and potentially obstructing the lawful recovery of estate documents places you in a difficult legal position." "Is that a threat?" Wyatt said. "It's information." "Then here's some information back." Wyatt stepped to the edge of the porch. "I sent word to Judge Alderman 3 days ago. He'll be here in 2 days, weather allowing. When he comes, he'll look at everything Clara has, and he'll make a determination based on what the law actually says, rather than what your client paid someone to argue it says." He looked at Fitch, then at Caldwell. "You're welcome to be present for that conversation. Or you're welcome to leave my property right now." Caldwell picked up his reins. 2 days, he said almost to himself. Then he looked at Clara with an expression that had nothing pleasant left in it at all. "You should have taken the offer. You should have left my father's land alone," she said. He turned his horse and rode back up the rise. Fitch followed without another word. Wyatt and Clara stood on the porch and watched them go, and neither one of them spoke until the sound of hooves had faded completely. Then Clara sat down on the porch steps. Not dramatically, just sat down the way you sit when you've been holding yourself upright by determination alone for long enough that your body finally negotiates a temporary ceasefire. Wyatt sat down beside her. "You did that well," he said. "My hands are shaking," she said. He looked. They were just slightly barely visible, but there. "That's allowed," he said. She looked at her hands for a moment. Then she pressed them flat against her knees and held them there. He said 2 days. Alderman's coming in 2 days. If Caldwell gets to him first. Alderman's not riding up a mountain road at this time of year to be gotten to, Wyatt said. He's riding up because he wants to see what you have. That's not a man who's already made up his mind in someone else's favor. She looked at him. "You trust that?" "I do." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because 18 years ago, before Alderman was a judge, he was a lawyer in Durango. He took on a case against a mining company that was redirecting water rights from 3 farming families. The mining company was owned by a man with considerably more money and connections than Alderman had. He took the case anyway, and he won it." Wyatt looked out across the yard. "A man who does that once usually means it." Clara absorbed this. "You've known him a long time." "Long enough." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "He called you out. Caldwell. He said you don't understand what you're standing in the middle of." "I heard him." "Do you understand it?" Wyatt turned to look at her directly. "I understand that a man used legal language to steal from your father. I understand that you spent 14 months building a case against him alone because there was no one else to build it. I understand that he's now trying to use the legal system he corrupted to shut that case down before it starts." He paused. "What I don't understand is how you did it alone for that long without breaking." She looked at him for a moment. Something in her face shifted, not breaking, but acknowledging the weight of the question. "I didn't do it without breaking," she said quietly. "I just did it after." That sentence landed somewhere in Wyatt's chest and stayed there. He stood up. "Come inside. We have 2 days to organize everything for Alderman, and I want it in an order that tells the story clearly before he reads a single word of Caldwell's version." She stood too. "You've done legal presentations before. I've sat across from enough bad ones to know what a good one looks like." He opened the door. "Come on." They spent the rest of that morning at the kitchen table. Wyatt cleared everything else off, and Clara laid out the documents in the order she'd originally arranged them, and then they spent 2 hours going through the entire sequence, not just reading, but building the narrative. What happened first? What each document proved, where the gaps were, and how Caldwell's lawyer would try to fill those gaps with a different story. Wyatt asked questions the way a skeptic would, not because he doubted her, but because aldermen would, and she needed the practice of answering someone who wasn't already on her side. The management agreement says he has authority to execute binding agreements, he said. His lawyer will argue the leases to Mountain Pacific were exactly that, binding agreements executed on behalf of the estate, which is what the agreement authorized. The agreement authorizes him to act in the estate's interest, she said. Leasing parcels at a third of market value while receiving private payments from the buyer is not acting in the estate's interest. It's acting in his own interest, at the estate's expense. Can you prove the market value of those parcels? She pulled out a second smaller envelope he hadn't seen before. Land assessments from the county recorder's office. I requested them through the lawyer in Glenwood Springs. Comparable parcels leased to other companies in the same period. He looked at her. She looked back steadily. I told you I'd been building this for 14 months. You told me, he said. I believed you. But there's a difference between believing something and seeing it. The assessments show the market rate was between 2 and 3 times what Caldwell charged Mountain Pacific. The differential multiplied by the total acreage leased represents a loss to the estate of approximately $4,000 over 14 months. And the side payments to Caldwell are documented in the correspondence at a total of roughly $600 over the same period. She paused. I know $600 sounds like less than $4,000, but the significance isn't the amount. It's that he received personal compensation from the same party he was supposedly negotiating on behalf of the estate against. That's not a management error. That's fraud. Wyatt sat back and looked at the table. The picture was clear. The evidence was solid. The narrative held together. The problem was that Caldwell knew all of this too, and had had 14 months of his own to prepare a counter-narrative. And Fitch was good. Wyatt had recognized it from the first 30 seconds of watching him work. He was the kind of lawyer who didn't argue facts he couldn't win, but instead argued the frame around. The facts shifted, the context changed. What question was being answered? He'll attack your credibility, Wyatt said. Not the documents directly. You. Clara nodded. I know. He'll say I was grief-stricken after my father's death. Unstable. That I became fixated on blaming Caldwell for my father's financial decisions, that I broke into his office in a disturbed state and removed documents I didn't understand, and that my interpretation of them reflects my emotional state rather than their actual content. Is there anyone who can speak to your character? Someone aldermen would respect. The lawyer in Glenwood Springs, Mrs. Harmon. She paused. Tom Elder's wife said, Tom Elder's wife isn't a witness, Wyatt said. Not yet. But Tom Elder has known your family 30 years, and he's got a reputation in this county for straight dealing. He paused. And Patricia Harmon sat in your father's house when he was sick. She can speak to his condition and his trust in Caldwell. Clara looked at him. You're thinking like a lawyer. I'm thinking like someone who's watched a few good men lose cases they should have won because they were right about the facts and unprepared for the story. She was quiet for a moment. Then, were you there when that happened? Once. His voice was flat. Water rights. A man named Jessup who farmed the creek land 3 miles south of here. He had legal right to the water going back to the original land grant. A timber company argued it away because their lawyer was better at telling stories than Jessup's lawyer was at telling the truth. He paused. I bought the south edge of Jessup's property after he had to sell. The price I paid him barely kept his family fed through the following winter. Clara was watching him. I've been angry about that for 11 years, he said. I'm not interested in watching the same thing happen again. Something shifted in her expression, not softness exactly, but recognition. The look of a person who has just understood that someone else's anger and their own come from the same place. That afternoon brought a visitor neither of them expected. It wasn't Caldwell, It wasn't a lawyer. It was Tom Elder himself riding up alone on his old roan, who came into the yard at 3 o'clock with his hat in his hand and the look of a man who has something to say and isn't entirely sure how to start. Wyatt came out of the barn. Tom. Wyatt? Tom Elder was a big man, 60 years old, with a face that had been honest so long it had set that way. I heard Caldwell was on your road this morning. 2 riders. Went back through town around noon. You heard right. Tom turned his hat in his hands. I want to talk to the Whitmore girl. If she's here, and if she's willing. Wyatt looked at him for a moment. Then he went to the house and came back with Clara, who stood in the yard and looked at Tom Elder with careful, measured eyes. Tom looked at her for a moment. Your father lent me $60 in the spring of '74 when I had a bad planting season and the bank wouldn't talk to me. Told me to pay it back when I could and not to worry about it in the meantime. He paused. I paid it back 3 years later with interest because that was the right thing to do, and your father was the kind of man who deserved the right thing. His jaw set. I know what Caldwell's been saying in town. I know what kind of man says those kinds of things about Daniel Whitmore's daughter. And I'd like you to know that if you need someone to tell Judge Alderman what they know about your father and about when Caldwell first started appearing in the valley, I'll ride to meet the judge myself. Clara looked at Tom Elder for a long moment. The effort of staying steady showed in her face not weakness, but the natural cost of being offered unexpectedly exactly the thing you'd stopped letting yourself hope for. Mr. Elder, she said, how much do you know about the timeline? When Caldwell arrived, how often he visited, what your father said about him? Tom's eyes sharpened. Enough. Your father talked to me about the arrangement he'd made. Said it gave him peace of mind. I should have asked more questions at the time. I know that now. He looked at her directly. Let me help fix it. She looked at Wyatt. Wyatt looked at her. She turned back to Tom. Yes, she said. I'd be grateful for that. Tom put his hat back on. I'll bring my wife. She sat with your father more than once in his last year. She can speak to his state of mind when those papers were signed. He picked up his reins. Alderman's a decent man. Give him the truth straight, and he'll do right by it. He rode back down the way he'd come, and the yard was quiet again. Clara stood with her arms crossed against herself. Not defensively. Just the way you hold yourself when something has just shifted, and you need a moment to find your footing in the new position. I keep expecting people to be worse than they are, she said. Not to Wyatt specifically, more to herself. People in this valley knew your father, Wyatt said. That counts. I've been alone in this for so long, she said. I forgot that could change. He didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't diminish it. The second day brought something Wyatt hadn't planned for. He'd ridden out at first light to check the Creek Road alderman would be coming, and he wanted to make sure the bridge repairs he'd done held weight, and when he came back, Clara wasn't in the house. He found her in the north field, standing at the fence line looking out at the mountain. He rode up and stepped down from the saddle without speaking. He stood beside her at the fence. She said, He's going to try to destroy me in front of Alderman. He's going to try, Wyatt said. I've been running over everything he could say, every angle, every way he could reframe what I did going into his office, taking the documents running. She paused. And the truth is, if you take those things out of context, they do look like the actions of a desperate, unstable woman. In context, they look like the actions of someone who knew she was running out of time and did what she had to do. Context is what lawyers argue about. She turned to look at him. What if Alderman doesn't see it clearly? What if Fitch is good enough to muddy it so much that... Clara? She stopped. He turned toward her at the fence. He wasn't a man who stood close to people. He'd maintained a careful physical distance from the world for 11 years, and it had become so habitual that he no longer noticed it consciously. He noticed it now because he didn't feel the usual pull to step back. You have the documents, he said. You have the land assessments. You have Tom Elder and Patricia Harmon and a lawyer in Glenwood Springs who reviewed the original agreement and knows exactly what it says. You have a federal judge coming up a mountain road specifically to look at your case." He held her gaze. "What Caldwell has is a story. Stories are easier to build than evidence, but they're also easier to take apart. You have evidence." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're sure?" "I'm sure that you've done everything right for 14 months under circumstances that would have broken most people. I'm sure that the evidence is what it is, and that it says what you say it says because I've read it myself." He paused. "What I'm not sure of is what Alderman will decide. That's the truth. But the only thing you can control is how clearly you tell it." Something in her face settled. Not relief, more like resolution. The look of a person who has asked the honest question and received an honest answer and knows that's the best available. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. They stood there for a moment longer at the fence line. The mountain was doing what mountains do, being enormously itself in the middle distance, indifferent to the small, urgent matters of human beings at its foot. Wyatt had always found something useful in that. The mountain had been there before his grief, and it would be there after. Everything was proportional, if you looked at it right. "Wyatt," she said. When this is over..." She stopped, started again. "I mean, when Alderman comes, and the case is whatever it's going to be, what happens to you? You've gotten yourself involved in something that Caldwell is going to remember. He's not the forgiving type." Wyatt looked at the mountain. "No, he's not. He could make trouble for you, the ranch, your water rights, your grazing permits. He could try. You're not worried." "I'm not easily moved," he said. "There's a difference." She was quiet for a moment. "You broke your rule for me." He looked at her. "The one about strangers," she said. "And then you got involved in something that could cost you considerably more than a night's sleep. And you didn't do it because you had to." She held his gaze steadily. "Why?" The question he'd deflected 5 days ago. It had come back. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the horses shifted in the field behind them, and the morning light moved, and somewhere up the ridge a hawk called once, and was answered by silence. "Because the last time I watched something wrong happen and didn't act," he said finally. "I spent 11 years building fences in the dark and calling it a life." He looked at her directly. "I'm done with that." She looked at him. He looked at her. The space between them at the fence rail was the same as it had always been physically, but something in it was different now, charged with a new weight, an awareness that hadn't been there before. Not the dramatic electricity of stories. Something quieter and more real than that. The recognition of two people who have been seeing each other clearly for a week and have just now admitted it to themselves. Clara looked away first, not from discomfort, from the need to process something that was larger than the moment. "We should go back," she said. "Alderman will be here by midday." "He will," Wyatt said. They walked back toward the house, and neither of them said anything else, and the silence between them was the kind that holds more than it could ever say. Alderman arrived at 11:30. He was a shorter man than Wyatt remembered, or maybe he'd just been younger the last time, and youth made everyone seem bigger. He was 60 now, with white hair and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, and he rode with the careful seat of a man who has spent decades on a horse, because his territory required it, not because he loved it. He dismounted in Wyatt's yard and shook Wyatt's hand, and then turned to Clara with the direct, unhurried assessment of a man who had been making judgments about people's honesty for 18 years. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I've come a long way to look at what you have." "I'm grateful you came, Judge," she said. "Don't be grateful yet." He wasn't unkind, just precise. "Show me first." They went inside and Clara laid the documents on the table, and what happened next was 3 hours of the most concentrated and exacting conversation Wyatt had ever sat in on. Alderman read everything, all of it. He asked questions that were sharper and more specific than anything Wyatt had thrown at her in their own preparation, and Clara answered each one without flinching. When he challenged the interpretation of the management agreement, she answered from the text directly. When he asked about the Glenwood Springs lawyer, she had his written analysis already pulled from the envelope. When he asked about the land valuations, she walked him through the county assessments line by line. Alderman took notes in a small notebook he'd brought with him, and the notes were extensive. At one point he stopped and took off his spectacles and looked at Clara with an expression that was neither warm nor cold, but simply evaluative. "Mr. Fitch paid me a visit yesterday evening," he said, "in Mill Creek. He rode through the night to do it." The room went quiet. "He presented me with a counter-declaration," Alderman said, "signed by 2 witnesses in Denver who are prepared to testify that you entered Mr. Caldwell's office under false pretenses, represented yourself as acting on behalf of the estate, and removed documents that belong to the estate's management files." Clara's face was very still. "He also provided a letter from a physician in Telluride," Alderman continued, "suggesting that you underwent a period of significant emotional disturbance following your father's death, during which your judgment and perceptions may have been unreliable." The kitchen was absolutely silent. Wyatt felt the thing shift, felt the weight of what Caldwell had been doing while they'd been organizing documents at this table. He'd been building his counterstory, professionally, efficiently, with the resources of a man who had done this before and knew exactly which pieces were needed. Alderman put his spectacles back on. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to answer it as directly as a person can." He looked at her over the spectacles. "Did you remove those documents from Caldwell's office without authorization?" "Yes," she said. The single syllable fell into the silence like a stone. "I went into his office while he was at a meeting," she said. "I told his clerk I needed to retrieve a personal letter my father had left there. The clerk let me in. I took the correspondence between Caldwell and Mountain Pacific because I knew what it contained, and I knew he would destroy it if I gave him any indication I was going to act on it." She held Alderman's gaze. "I did not misrepresent myself to anyone. I said I needed to retrieve something. That was true. I needed to retrieve the evidence of what was being done to my father's estate." "Yitiye." Alderman looked at her for a long moment. "The physician's letter," she said. "I know which doctor wrote it. He examined me once, 6 weeks after my father died at Caldwell's suggestion. He said I was grieving and recommended rest." Her voice was steady. "Grief is not instability, and I was right about what those documents contained." Alderman looked down at the papers. He looked at the correspondence. He looked at the land assessments. He picked up the letter from the Glenwood Springs lawyer and read it again slowly, with the focused attention of someone who has spent 18 years understanding exactly what language is doing versus what it appears to be doing. Then he closed his notebook. "I'm going to need to speak to Mr. Elder," he said, "and Mrs. Harmon, and your lawyer in Glenwood Springs by written correspondence." He stood up and straightened his coat. "I'm also going to send a wire to the Gunnison County Court about a case from 2 years ago that I've had in the back of my mind since your letter arrived, Mr. Dawson." Wyatt looked at him. "The widow." The widow." Alderman picked up his hat. "Cases don't exist in isolation. Context matters." He looked at Clara. "You'll have my determination within 10 days. Don't go anywhere." "I won't," she said. He shook Wyatt's hand again, and then briefly with the professional restraint of a man who never showed his hand. Until the time was right, he looked at Clara with something in his eyes that wasn't quite a reassurance, but was close enough to one that she felt it. He rode out. The kitchen was very quiet. Clara stood at the table with her hands flat on the papers and her eyes closed, just for a moment. Just long enough. Then she opened them. "He believed me," she said. Not a question. A careful, tentative reading of what she'd just seen. "He's not done yet," Wyatt said. "But yes." She looked at the table. At the documents she'd carried across 3 days of mountain road in the rain. At the evidence she'd spent 14 months assembling in the silence of her own grief. 10 days, she said. 10 days, he confirmed. She looked up at him. "That means I'm still here for 10 more days." He held her gaze. Something moved through the space between them, not the careful distance they'd been maintaining, but something warmer and less managed than that. Something that neither of them had planned for when this started, and both of them could feel shifting into a new shape, now that the immediate crisis had passed, and left them standing in his kitchen, with nothing between them but the truth of the last week. "I know," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she started gathering the documents back into the oilcloth envelope slowly and carefully, the way you handle things that matter. And Wyatt went to the stove to put the coffee on. Because that was what you did after something hard. You made coffee, you sat down, and you let the next thing come when it was ready. The 10 days ahead would be different from the first 5. They both knew it without saying it, the way you know a season is changing before it announces itself, in the quality of the light, in the way the air sits differently, in the feeling that whatever you thought this was, it has become something else. Something neither of them had a rule for. The 10 days felt nothing like the first 5. The first 5 had been survival, a woman running from something, a man holding to a rule, both of them navigating the narrow space between necessity and trust. These 10 days were different. The emergency had passed. Alderman had the documents. Tom Elder and Patricia Harmon had been spoken to. The legal machinery was in motion, slow and deliberate, the way it always moved when it was actually working rather than being manipulated. What was left was ordinary life, and ordinary life, it turned out, was considerably harder to manage than a crisis. Wyatt noticed it on the first morning after Alderman's visit, the particular quality of the silence at breakfast, which was no longer the silence of two strangers, being careful with each other, but the silence of two people who had said something true the day before, and were now living in the aftermath of it. He'd told her he was done building fences in the dark and calling it a life. She'd heard exactly what he meant, and now they were sitting at his kitchen table, drinking coffee in the morning light, and neither of them quite knew what the next sentence was supposed to be. He solved it the way he solved most things. He finished his coffee, put on his hat, and went to work. She solved it the way she solved most things. She cleared the table, found something that needed doing, and did it. By midday, they'd been on opposite ends of the ranch for 4 hours, and both of them were working harder than the actual tasks required. Wyatt was recoiling a perfectly good rope for the second time when he caught himself and stopped and stood in the barn doorway and thought about what he was doing. He was a man who had spent 11 years being honest with himself about everything except the one thing that mattered. He could admit that now. He'd been honest about grief, honest about loneliness, honest about the practical dimensions of his solitary life. But he had not been honest about the fear underneath all of it, the specific fear that had nothing to do with death or loss, and everything to do with the terrifying vulnerability of wanting someone to stay. He hung the rope on its hook and went to find her. She was in the garden doing what she'd been doing all week, coaxing the herb beds back into order, the quiet, ongoing reclamation of something that had been left untended too long. She looked up when she heard him come through the gate, and something in her face did the thing it had started doing recently, relaxed slightly, as if his presence had resolved a question she hadn't been consciously asking. "I owe you something," he said. She straightened up. "What?" "An honest answer. To the question you asked me that first day, and again at the fence line." He stood across the bed from her. "You asked me why I was doing this. I kept deflecting. That wasn't fair." She looked at him carefully. "You don't owe me anything." "I'm not offering it because I owe it," he said. "I'm offering it because it's true, and I've been carrying it around for a week, and I'm not built for that." She waited. "When you knocked on my door," he said, "I was going to close it. I had my hand on the door and my answer ready, and I was going to close it the same way I'd closed it twice before." He held her gaze. "And then I looked at you. And what I saw wasn't a stranger asking for shelter. What I saw was someone who had been doing an extraordinarily hard thing alone for a very long time and who was still standing." He paused. "I didn't let you in because I felt sorry for you. I let you in because something in me recognized something in you, and I hadn't felt that in 11 years, and it stopped my hand on the door." Clara was very still. "That's why," he said. "That's the honest answer." She looked at him across the herb bed for a long moment. The garden was quiet around them. Somewhere behind her, the rosemary bush was doing its sprawling thing, and the time was taking care of itself the way she'd said it would. "The night you found me in the kitchen at 2 in the morning?" she said finally. "You made tea." "I did. Nobody had made me tea in a very long time." Her voice was level, but he could hear what was underneath it. "I've been managing things alone for 14 months, and before that I was managing my father's illness, and before that, well, I've been managing things for a while." She looked at the garden, rather than at him for a moment. "I came to your door because it was the last door on the road, but when you made tea at 2 in the morning and sat across the table and didn't ask questions, I thought, for the first time in a very long time, that I might be in a place where I could stop managing for a minute." Wyatt didn't say anything. "That frightened me," she said, "because I'd gotten good at managing alone, and the last time I stopped, the last time I let someone else carry part of it, the person I trusted most signed his name on a document that cost me everything." She finally looked at him. "I'm not saying that's your situation. I know the difference. I'm saying that's what I brought through your door with me, and I thought you should know." He looked at her steadily. "I know what it is to build walls and call them self-sufficiency." "Yes," she said. "I've noticed." The corner of his mouth moved. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was closer to one than his face usually got without effort. "We're a pair." "We are," she agreed, not lightly, seriously, with the weight of someone acknowledging a true thing. He picked up a fallen stake from the edge of the bed and pressed it back into the earth without really thinking about it. "The 10 days will be up in 9 more days, and then Alderman will send word and the legal matter will be resolved one way or another." "One way," she said firmly. "We've been over the evidence." "One way," he conceded. "And after that you'll have your land back and a choice about what to do with it." "Yes, I want you to make that choice freely." He looked up from the stake. "Not feeling like you've got nowhere else to go. Not out of gratitude, not because of bridges being out or roads being impassable." He held her gaze. "I need you to know that this, whatever this is, it doesn't come with any claim attached." Clara looked at him for a long, considering moment. "Wyatt Dawson," she said, "has anyone ever told you that you are considerably more complicated than you appear?" "Once or twice," he said. "It's never been meant as a compliment. I mean it as one." She picked up her garden tool and turned back to the bed. "Go do your fencing, or whatever it is you were pretending to do on the other end of the ranch. I'll have lunch ready at noon." He went. But he took the long way back across the south field, and he was aware the entire walk that something had shifted in the architecture of his life quietly without announcement, the way structural things shift, and that there was no going back to the shape it had been in before. On the 3rd day of the 10, a letter arrived from Fitch. Not delivered by Fitch himself, sent through the post, which arrived in Mill Creek every Tuesday with the supply wagon, and was brought up the mountain road by old Mr. Teller, who handled the rural deliveries in exchange for grazing rights on Wyatt's south pasture. Teller handed it over with the particular expression of a man who knows a letter is significant without knowing why, and Wyatt took it inside without opening it. Clara was at the table when he came in. She looked at the envelope in his hand. "Fitch," he said, and set it down. She picked it up, read the return address, set it back down. "Open it," Wyatt said. She opened it. It was 3 pages in Fitch's precise legal handwriting, and it took her 4 minutes to read it fully. He could tell by the way her expression changed, cycling through things he couldn't name fast enough to catalog them. When she finished, she set it on the table and looked at the wall for a moment. "He's amended the complaint," she said. "He's now claiming that the original management agreement included an oral provision, not written, just verbal, in which my father agreed to give Caldwell full authority to dispose of estate assets at his discretion, including the right to retain a negotiating fee from third-party transactions." Her voice was very even, too even. "He says he has a witness, someone who was present during the conversation with my father." Wyatt pulled the letter toward him and read it himself. The witness was named Joseph Carver, A former employee of her father's, the letter said. A man who had worked on the Whitmore farm for 2 seasons and been present. Fitch claimed during the conversation in which Daniel Whitmore had explicitly authorized the fee arrangement. Wyatt read it twice, then he put it down. "Do you know a Joseph Carver?" he asked. Clara's jaw was tight. "He worked for my father the year before he got sick. He left in the fall of '76. I don't know where he went." She paused. "I don't know what Caldwell paid him, but I know that conversation didn't happen." "How do you know?" She looked at him. "Because my father talked to me about every significant decision he made regarding the property. Every one. He told me about the management agreement in detail, what he believed it contained, why he'd signed it, what he thought it protected. He never mentioned any oral provision." Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, just barely, just enough to show that underneath the composure was someone who had loved her father and was now watching his reputation be built into a lie, brick by brick. "My father did not give Henry Caldwell permission to take money from the people he was supposed to be negotiating against. He did not." Wyatt was quiet. "I know," he said. She looked at him. "I know he didn't," he said. "That's not what I'm working out." He stood up and went to the window and stood there not looking out, just standing with his back to the room and thinking the way he thought, straight and quiet and without wasted motion. "Carver," he said. "If he worked for your father for 2 seasons, someone in Mill Creek knew him. Someone knows where he went." Clara was already ahead of him. "Tom Elder. He was at the farm constantly that year. He'd know Carver by sight and possibly by destination. Send word to Tom today." He turned around. "And write to your lawyer in Glenwood Springs immediately. Alderman needs to know about this amendment before it reaches him from Caldwell's direction. If Alderman gets Fitch's version first." "He won't read it in isolation," Wyatt said, "but he needs yours first, tonight if possible." She was already moving to the writing desk. He watched her sit down and uncap the ink and begin writing with the focused intensity of a person who has been outmaneuvered before and is not interested in letting it happen twice. Her handwriting was fast and clear and certain, and she wrote 3 pages in the time it would have taken most people to organize their thoughts. When she finished, she sealed the letter and looked up. "I'm sending one to Alderman directly as well," she said. "Is that appropriate?" "Under the circumstances," Wyatt said. "I think a judge who rode up a mountain road specifically to see your case will find it appropriate." She wrote a second letter. He rode them to Mill Creek himself at a pace the road barely allowed, and put them in the hands of the postwriter personally, with instructions that they went out on the morning stage without exception. When he got back, she was at the stove and she'd made dinner, and she looked up when he came in with the expression of a person who has done everything they can do for the moment and is now waiting, which is the hardest part. "Done," he said. She nodded. "Thank you." "Stop thanking me. You keep doing things that warrant it." "So do you." He hung his hat and coat. "You've been doing them for 14 months without anyone thanking you once. One letter ride doesn't balance that." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Sit down, Wyatt. Dinner's ready." He sat down. They ate, and outside the mountain evening did what it always did, indifferent and enormous. And inside the kitchen, 2 people who had been alone for a long time sat across from each other and were, without making a particular ceremony of it, not alone. On the 6th day of the 10, Tom Elder came back. He knew where Joseph Carver had gone. Carver had left Mill Creek in the fall of '76 and gone south to Durango, where his sister lived, and Tom had kept loose contact because Carver had borrowed a piece of equipment and returned it by mail with a note that included an address. "The address is 2 years old," Tom said. "But it's something." "It's enough," Wyatt said. "I can ride to Durango." Clara looked at him sharply. "Durango is 3 days. 2.5 if the pass road is clear." "Wyatt, if we can find Carver and establish that he has no credible knowledge of the conversation Fitch is claiming he witnessed." Wyatt said, "Caldwell's amended complaint falls apart. The entire new structure he's built depends on that one witness." He looked at her steadily. It's worth 3 days. She looked at him for a long moment. Something was happening behind her eyes. The particular internal argument of a person who is used to fighting alone and is learning slowly and not without difficulty to let someone fight beside them. "I'll go with you," she said. "The road's hard." "I've done harder." She met his gaze. "And it's my case, Wyatt, my father's land. I'm not staying here while you ride 3 days on my behalf." Tom Elder, who had been watching this exchange with the expression of a man witnessing something he won't mention, but will remember, said, "I'll look after the ranch while you're gone. Be good to spend some time with the horses." Wyatt looked at Clara. Clara looked at Wyatt. "We leave at first light," he said. The road to Durango was everything the mountain roads in Colorado always were, in late summer demanding, in ways that had nothing to do with distance and everything to do with the nature of the terrain and the company. They rode for 2.5 days, and they talked, not the way they'd talked at the kitchen table, which had always had the shape of strategy of preparation of two people with a common problem working through it together. This was different. This was the conversation that happens when there's nothing to do but cover ground, and the ground takes a long time to cover, and all the things that get deferred in the name of urgency run out of excuses. He told her about Martha. Not the death, he'd told her that. He told her about the marriage, the arguments, the laughter, the particular joy of being known by someone and knowing them back. He told it plainly, without sentimentality, the way a man tells a thing he's proud of and still misses. She told him about her father. Not the illness, she told him that. She told him about the man before the illness, the farmer who knew every plant on his land by name, who told jokes so rarely that when he did the room lit up, who had taught her to set a horse's leg and treat a stone bruise and read a legal document and grow thyme in poor soil. "He would have liked you," she said on the second evening when they'd made camp by the creek and the fire was doing its work. Wyatt looked at her across the fire. "Why?" "Because you do things that need doing and you don't make a production of it." She poked the fire with a stick. He hated production. Said it was the sign of a man who cared more about being seen doing a thing than actually doing it. Smart man. Exceptionally smart man who signed his name on the wrong document. She set the stick down. "I've made peace with that. It took time, but I have. He was tired and frightened, and he trusted someone he shouldn't have. That's not stupidity. That's humanity." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "When did you make peace with it?" She thought about it. "About 4 miles south of your barn," she said. "When you told me about Jessup and the water rights. When I understood that you'd been angry about an injustice for 11 years because you couldn't stop it, and that anger was actually love in a different form." She met his eyes across the fire. "I understood my father better after that. He signed that document because he loved me, and he was trying to protect me, and he did the best he could with what he had." Her voice was steady. "That's enough." The fire crackled between them. "Clara," he said. What do you want after all of this? After the land is back and Caldwell is dealt with and the legal matter is closed?" He looked at her directly. "What does your life look like?" She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the fire shifted, and the creek made its steady sound in the background. "I want to teach again," she said. "I was good at it, and I missed it the moment I stopped. Mill Creek School needs a teacher. It's needed one since I left." She paused. "And I want to know that the land is there, my father's land. I don't know if I'll live on it, but I want to know it's there, that what he built didn't disappear into someone else's profit." "That's what you want for the land," Wyatt said. "What do you want for yourself?" She looked at him across the fire. The question sat between them with all its weight. "I want to stop being afraid of needing people," she said, quietly. Not dramatically, just a statement of truth, direct and undecorated. "I got very good at not needing anyone. I thought that was strength. Now I think it was just the only option I had, and I dressed it up as a virtue, because that was easier than admitting I was lonely." She held his gaze. "I want to stop doing that." Wyatt looked at the fire. "I know something about that," he said. "I know you do." The creek ran. The fire settled. The enormous dark of the Colorado mountains pressed in around them, and inside it the small circle of light and warmth felt to both of them like more than the sum of its parts. Joseph Carver was in Durango. He was working at a livery stable on the south end of town, a lean, sunburned man of 40, with the look of someone who had been comfortable once and had learned to be less so. He looked up when Wyatt and Clara walked in, and when he recognized Clara, something moved through his face. Not fear exactly, but the close cousin of guilt that lives next door to it. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Carver?" She didn't waste time. "You know why I'm here." He looked at Wyatt, then back at her. He set down the brush he'd been using on a bay mare. "He paid you," Clara said. It wasn't a question. Carver's jaw worked for a moment. "Miss Whitmore, how much—" Silence. "Mr. Carver." Her voice was level and absolute. "I am going before a federal judge in 4 days. Henry Caldwell has submitted a declaration claiming that you witnessed a conversation between him and my father, in which my father gave him explicit oral permission to accept negotiating fees from third parties." She looked at him steadily. "That conversation did not happen. You know it didn't happen. And I think you know that perjury in a federal land case is not a small thing." Carver looked at the ground. "He paid me $50, he said finally. "Sent a man to find me 2 weeks ago." "And what were you to say?" "That I was there when your father and Caldwell talked. That your father said the fees were fine, that he understood the arrangement." He rubbed his face with his hand. "I wasn't there. I never heard any such conversation. Your father never said anything of the kind to Caldwell in my presence." Clara said nothing for a moment. Then, "Will you say that to a judge?" Carver looked up. The guilt was fully present in his face now, and underneath it, something that looked like relief. The relief of a man who has been carrying a lie for 2 weeks and has just been given an exit. "He told me it was just paperwork," Carver said. "A formality. He said nobody would actually call me to testify, it was just to satisfy a legal technicality." He shook his head. "I don't want to go to jail over Henry Caldwell's technicality." "You won't go to jail," Clara said. "You'll give a sworn statement contradicting the declaration you signed, explain that you were paid and misled about its purpose, and provide the name of the man Caldwell sent to find you." She held his gaze. "That's all." Carver looked at Wyatt. Wyatt said, "She's telling you the truth." Carver looked back at Clara. He looked at the floor. He looked at the mare waiting patiently for her brush. "All right," he said. They got the statement written and witnessed by the Durango County Clerk the next morning, and they turned around for the mountain road before noon. On the ride back, Clara was quieter than she'd been on the way down. Not unhappily quiet, the focused quiet of someone processing a significant thing. Wyatt rode beside her, and let the quiet be what it was. On the second day back, with a day's ride still between them and the ranch, she said, "It's almost over." "Almost. 3 days until Alderman's 10 days are up. We'll be back before then." She rode for a moment. "And then—" He looked over at her. She was looking at the road ahead, her profile steady in the mountain afternoon light. "And then," he said, "you'll have your answer from Alderman, and your land back, and a choice." She was quiet. "Clara," he said. She looked at him. "Whatever you choose," he said carefully. "I need you to know that what happened at the ranch the last 2 weeks, that wasn't just me helping you with a legal problem." He held her gaze across the space between their horses. "I need you to know that." She looked at him for a long moment. "I know," she said. "I'm not asking for anything." "I know that too." The corner of her mouth moved. "You're very bad at asking for things." "I'm working on it." She looked at the road ahead again, but the corner of her mouth stayed where it was. "Ask me after Alderman's determination," she said. "Ask me when I'm choosing freely. When there are no bridges out, and no legal cases, and no emergencies left. She glanced at him. Ask me then. Wyatt looked at the road ahead. The ranch was a day away. Alderman's determination was 3 days away. Whatever came after it was further than that, and the shape of it was not yet clear. But riding back through the mountain afternoon with a woman who had just dismantled a false witness and a river sound in the background, and a statement in his saddlebag that would likely end Henry Caldwell's case against the Whitmore estate. Wyatt Dawson felt something he hadn't felt in 11 years. Not happiness exactly. Something more fundamental than that. The feeling that the future was something he was riding toward, rather than something he was building walls against. He kept that to himself because he was not a man who spoke such things before they were ready to be spoken. But he rode the last day back, with his shoulders carrying less weight than they had in longer than he could accurately remember, and the ranch, when it finally appeared at the end of the road in the late afternoon light, looked different than it ever had before. It looked like somewhere he was arriving, rather than somewhere he had simply never left. Alderman's letter arrived on the 9th day. Not the 10th. The 9th, which meant he'd written it the day after receiving Clara's second letter and Carver's sworn statement, which meant he'd moved faster than a territorial judge typically moved on anything, which meant something. Wyatt was in the barn when Tom Elder came up the road with the post. Tom didn't call out from the yard the way he usually did. He came directly to the barn door and held out the envelope with an expression that was carefully neutral in the way of a man who wants very much to know what's inside something, but has enough decency not to say so. For Miss Whitmore, Tom said. Came in on the morning stage. Wyatt took it. He looked at the seal. Alderman's official mark, the territorial court stamp he'd seen on documents before, never on anything addressed to his ranch. He walked to the house. Clara was at the writing desk. She'd been writing to the Glenwood Springs lawyer every other day since they'd returned from Durango, keeping him informed, which Wyatt understood was her way of maintaining some illusion of control over a situation that had moved largely into other people's hands. She looked up when he came through the door, and she saw the envelope before he said anything. She stood up. She crossed the room and took it from him. She held it for a moment without opening it. Just held it the way you hold something when you know it contains the answer to a question you've been living inside for 14 months, and you need one more second before the living inside it is over. Then she opened it. He watched her read. He'd gotten good at reading her face by now, the particular vocabulary of her expressions, what each shift meant, where the composure was genuine, and where it was effort. He watched her go through the first page, the second, and halfway through the third, and then he watched something happen in her face that he had not seen there before. She sat down, not dramatically. Her knees simply made the decision before the rest of her did. He ruled in my favor, she said. Wyatt was quiet. The management agreement is voided, she said. Her voice was very careful, handling the words like they might break. On the grounds of fraudulent misrepresentation, Caldwell's description of the agreement to my father did not match its actual legal function, which constitutes fraud in the inducement. She looked up. The leases to Mountain Pacific are suspended pending review. The estate assets are restored to the Whitmore title. She stopped, and he's referring the case to the federal district attorney in Denver regarding the side payments. The criminal question. Wyatt looked at her. It's over, she said. Those 2 words carried the weight of 14 months. Every morning she'd gotten up and done the next necessary thing. Every night she'd put herself to sleep in the knowledge that she was fighting alone. Every document sorted, every lawyer paid with the last of her savings. Every mile of mountain road with evidence under her arm, and a man with resources hunting her. All of it compressed into 2 words. It's over, he said. She put the letter down on the table and looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at Wyatt, and he saw something in her face he hadn't seen since the night she'd arrived in the rain. Not the composure, not the determination, not the controlled steadiness she wore like armor. He saw the person underneath all of that. The 27-year-old woman who had loved her father and buried him and been robbed in his name and refused to stop fighting. She was not crying. She was something past that. She was simply fully present in the moment in a way that the last 14 months hadn't allowed. "Tom Elder is outside," Wyatt said quietly. She laughed. It came out slightly broken at the edges, which only made it more real. "Of course he is. He's been carrying that envelope for 3 miles trying to look like he doesn't care what's in it." She stood up and straightened herself and went to the door and opened it. Tom was in the yard, doing a very convincing impression of a man examining a fence post with great interest. "Tom," she said. He turned. "He ruled in my favor." Tom Elder, 60 years old, and built by 4 decades of hard weather, into something that did not move easily, sat down on the porch step and put his hat over his face for a moment. "Good," he said from under the hat. His voice was not entirely level. "Good. Jacaranda." The news moved through Mill Creek the way news always moves through a small valley, faster than logic can explain, and slower than the people involved would prefer. By the following morning, half the town knew. By the afternoon, Patricia Harmon had sent word that she was coming up the road on Saturday, with food enough for 20 people, whether anyone had invited her or not. What Wyatt hadn't expected was what came next. On the 3rd day after the letter, a writer came up from town with a second piece of correspondence. Not from Alderman this time, but from Raymond Fitch. 2 pages clipped and professional, informing Clara Whitmore that his client, Henry Caldwell, was appealing the territorial court decision to the Federal Circuit Court in Denver, and that all parties should consider the matter unresolved pending the outcome of that appeal. Wyatt read it standing at the kitchen table. Clara read it beside him. When she finished, she set it down. "He's not done," she said. "No," Wyatt said. She was quiet for a moment. He could see her processing it, the recalibration, the way you reset your footing when the ground moves under you again just after you thought it had steadied. "A Federal Circuit appeal," she said. "That's Denver. That's months. Possibly longer." "Possibly. And expensive." She looked at the table. "My lawyer in Glenwood Springs can handle territorial court. Federal Circuit is a different matter." Wyatt looked at her. "I know a man in Denver. Practiced federal land law for 15 years before he retired to Telluride. He owes me a conversation." She looked at him sharply. "Wyatt, don't. I can't keep accepting." "You're not accepting anything. I'm making a choice." He held her gaze. "The same way you made a choice when you went into Caldwell's office. You didn't ask permission. You did what the situation required." She looked at him for a long moment. "This isn't going to be short," she said. "A federal appeal. Even if we win, it's going to be months of this." "I know. You've already put yourself in Caldwell's path. He's a man who holds grudges and has lawyers on retainer. He could make your life—" "Clara." His voice was quiet. "Absolute. I told you at the fence line. I'm done building walls and calling it a life." He looked at her steadily. "Whatever this takes, I'm not going anywhere." She looked at him. In the 11 years she would later look back on this moment, she would remember most precisely the quality of the silence that followed. Not empty, not tense, but full. The silence of 2 people standing on the same piece of ground, and both knowing it. "All right," she said. "Make the introduction." He sent the wire to Telluride that afternoon. What happened next was not dramatic. Drama was for stories that resolved in a single moment. This was life, which resolved in a different way, slowly through accumulation, through the daily arithmetic of showing up. The lawyer in Telluride, a man named Harcastle, who had 20 years of federal land law in his handshake, and the unflappable temperament of someone who had won difficult cases against expensive opponents before, reviewed everything Clara had, and wrote back in 10 days, with a response that was the legal equivalent of a man rolling up his sleeves. He had 2 things Fitch didn't expect. The first was the Gunnison County case. Alderman had sent for the records as promised, and what those records contained was not as originally understood a widow who had simply withdrawn her complaint. It was a widow who had been visited 3 times by a man matching Caldwell's description in the 2 weeks before she withdrew, and who had signed a private settlement that had never been disclosed to the court. Hardcastle got the widow's name. Hardcastle went to see her. Her name was Margaret Estes. She was 64 years old, and she had been frightened into silence 2 years ago by a man who told her that fighting Henry Caldwell was more expensive than anything she had left, and that the settlement he was offering was the best deal she would ever see. She hadn't believed him. She'd just been too tired and too alone to fight him. When Hardcastle explained what was happening with the Whitmore case, and what the Gunnison records showed, and what her testimony could mean, Margaret Estes sat across the table from him and was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "What do I need to sign?" Wyatt received Hardcastle's letter on a Tuesday morning and read it at the kitchen table with Clara beside him and Tom Elder sitting in the corner, because Tom had developed a habit of appearing at significant moments that nobody had exactly authorized, but everyone had quietly accepted. "She'll testify," Wyatt said when he'd finished reading. Clara looked at him. "To what?" That Caldwell approached her directly before she withdrew her complaint. That the settlement was coerced. That she was told explicitly that fighting him was futile. He set the letter down. "Pattern of conduct. It's the federal standard you can't prosecute a man for a single fraud if his lawyers can argue it was an error in judgment, but a documented pattern of the same scheme applied to multiple landowners is a different question entirely." Clara read the letter herself. When she finished, she looked at the table. "He did this to someone else," she said, "and she was alone with it for 2 years. "She won't be alone with it anymore," Wyatt said. Clara looked at him. "None of you will be," he said. The Federal Circuit hearing was set for 60 days out in Denver. In those 60 days, Wyatt's ranch underwent a transformation that he did not plan and could not have predicted and would not, looking back, have changed a single detail of. Clara stayed. Not because the bridge was out. Not because she had nowhere else to go. Not because the case required her presence at the ranch. Specifically, Hardcastle was in Denver. Alderman's ruling stood pending appeal, and the mechanics of the legal matter no longer required her in any one place. She stayed because she chose to. She told him so on a Wednesday evening, sitting on the porch with her mending, the same position she'd been in 6 days after she arrived, when he'd first understood that something was changing in the ordinary structure of his life. "I'm staying," she said. "Not because of the case, not because I'm waiting for the appeal, because I want to be here." She looked at him directly. "I wanted to say it plainly, so there wasn't any ambiguity." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "You said to ask you when you were choosing freely," he said, "when there were no emergencies left." "There are still emergencies," she said. "There will probably always be emergencies. I don't think that's the right threshold." She held his gaze. "The right threshold is whether I know my own mind. And I do." He looked at her for a long moment. "I'm not easy to live alongside," he said. "I'm solitary by habit. I say less than I should. I work instead of talking when things are difficult." "I know," she said. "I've been watching you do all of that for 3 weeks. And I grew up with a man who spoke mostly through what he did rather than what he said, and I learned to read that language a long time ago." She set her mending down. "I'm not asking you to be different than you are, Wyatt. I'm asking you to let me stay." He looked at her. "Stay," he said. Simple and direct, the only way he knew how to mean something completely. She picked her mending back up, and the evening continued, the way evenings on that porch had been continuing, the two of them working in the quiet that had stopped being silence and started being something more like home. The Denver hearing lasted 2 days. Hardcastle argued the appeal with the focused precision of a man who had spent his entire career waiting for exactly this kind of case. The kind where the evidence was clean, the pattern was clear, and the opposing counsel's strongest argument was complexity rather than truth. Fitch was good. Wyatt, watching from the gallery, acknowledged that. Fitch built a narrative that was technically coherent and professionally presented, and completely insufficient. Because Margaret Estes took the stand on the second morning. She was 64 years old, and she had been frightened into silence for 2 years. And when she walked into that federal courtroom and sat down across from Henry Caldwell, She looked at him with the steady, unfrightened gaze of a woman who had decided she was done being afraid of him. She told the truth. All of it. The visits before she withdrew her complaint. The man Caldwell sent. The things she was told about how expensive fighting would be, and how certain she was to lose. The settlement she signed, not because she believed it was right, but because she had run out of strength to refuse. The federal courtroom was very quiet while she talked. Caldwell's expression across the room went through several changes that his careful composure could not entirely contain. When Margaret Estes stepped down, Hardcastle presented the comparative analysis of both cases, the Whitmore estate and the Estes property, the identical structure of the management agreements, the identical pattern of below-market leasing with private side payments, the identical approach when challenged. 2 cases. 2 widows and orphans. One man who had treated the legal system as a mechanism for personal enrichment and had been very careful each time to ensure the people he targeted were too isolated and too exhausted to fight effectively, until they weren't. The federal judge took 1 day to deliberate. He upheld Alderman's territorial ruling in full. He referred the criminal matter to the federal district attorney with a recommendation for prosecution on fraud and coercion grounds. He noted in his written determination that the pattern of conduct demonstrated across both cases suggested not an error in judgment, but a deliberate and repeated scheme. Henry Caldwell walked out of the federal courthouse in Denver into the hands of a process that was no longer one territorial judge's determination, but a federal criminal referral. Fitch, to his credit, said nothing to anyone on the way out. Clara stood in the corridor outside the courtroom and read the determination in Hardcastle's hands, and she was completely still for a long time. Then she looked at Wyatt. He was watching her. He'd been watching her since Margaret Estes sat down and started talking. Watching what it did to Clara's face, to see someone else's version of her own story, told plainly in a room full of people who were finally paying attention. "It's really over," she said. "It's really over," he said. She looked at the determination in Hardcastle's hands for another moment. Then she said quietly to nobody in particular and everybody present, "My father's land is his again." Hardcastle shook both their hands with the satisfied dignity of a man who has done the right work and knows it. Margaret Estes found Clara in the corridor, and the 2 women stood together for a moment not speaking, because there wasn't a sentence available that would have been adequate just standing in the same space in the particular solidarity of people who have survived the same thing from different ends. "Thank you for coming forward," Clara said. "Thank you for not stopping," Margaret said. They rode back from Denver over 3 days, and on the 3rd evening with the ranch visible at the end of the road. In the late light, Wyatt stopped his horse. Clara pulled up beside him. He looked at the ranch, at the house which had smoke from the chimney because Tom Elder had been staying there while they were gone, and Tom Elder apparently believed in keeping a fire going regardless of the season. At the barn where Patience and Clement and the 2 geldings were housed. At the herb garden Clara had been systematically rescuing from years of neglect. At the porch where they'd been sitting in the evenings for a month, working in the quiet that had become the shape of their shared life. "I need to ask you something," he said. Clara looked at him. "You said you'd ask me when the emergencies were over." "The emergencies are over." "Then ask." He turned to look at her directly. The evening light was in her face, and she was looking at him with the clear, steady eyes that had been reading him accurately since the second day she was in his house. And he thought about what he'd said to her at the fence line. "I'm done building walls in the dark and calling it a life." And he thought about Martha, who would have liked Clara very much, who would have found her practical and fierce and entirely worth knowing. And he thought about 11 years of silence and one storm night that had changed the shape of everything. "I know you want to teach again," he said. "I know Mill Creek needs a teacher. I know the Whitmore property is 8 miles from this ranch, and you could live there, and I could ride to see you on Tuesdays, or we could work out some other arrangement that's reasonable and sensible, and takes into account the fact that you are an independent woman with your own life to build." He held her gaze. "I also know that's not what I want." She waited. "I want you here," he said, "not as a guest, not temporarily." Here in this house, on this ranch, at that kitchen table, and on that porch, and in that garden, that was your idea to fix, and you were right about." He paused. "I'm asking you to build it with me. Whatever that looks like, whatever arrangements make sense to you, whatever pace, whatever terms you need it to be, but here, with me." Clara looked at him for a long time. The evening was very still around them. The horses were patient. The ranch at the end of the road waited with the solid indifference of something that has been standing long enough to know that the important things happen in their own time and cannot be hurried. "The Whitmore property," she said. "I heard you. It should be maintained. I won't just leave it empty. We'll hire someone," he said, "or we'll work it together on the weeks it needs it. It doesn't have to disappear. It just doesn't have to be where you sleep. I want to keep teaching. Mill Creek School." 8 miles, he said. "I can build you a reason to make that ride every morning. I can build you a reason to come back every evening." Something moved through her face. Not the careful composure, not the determination, not the controlled steadiness. The real thing underneath all of it. The woman who had knocked on a stranger's door in a storm and tried not to need anything, and had been slowly, inexorably undone by the fact that the stranger had made her tea, and stepped aside, and told her the truth, and ridden to Durango and back without being asked. "Yes," she said. One word, the same weight as the two she'd spoken in Alderman's kitchen. It's over, but pointed in a different direction, toward instead of away from. "Yes," she said again, like she wanted to hear it twice, like she was making certain it was real. He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand. She looked down at their hands for a moment. Then she looked up at him. "You know, this means Patricia Harmon is going to organize something," she said. "She's already planning it. She told Tom Elder 3 weeks ago." Clara laughed. The real laugh, unguarded, the one he'd been hearing more and more frequently, and which had become, without his noticing the exact moment it happened, one of the sounds he organized his day around. "Let's go home," he said. They rode the last stretch of road side by side, and the ranch came up to meet them in the evening light, and Tom Elder was on the porch with 2 cups of coffee already poured, as if he'd timed the whole thing, which, knowing Tom, he probably had. The following spring, Mill Creek had a schoolteacher again. She rode the 8 miles from Wyatt's ranch every morning on a bay mare that Patience had been replaced by, because Patience had decided Clara was hers the previous autumn, and the matter had not been open to negotiation. She taught 43 children in a 1-room schoolhouse, and she was, by every account that reached Wyatt's ears, exactly the teacher those children needed, clear-eyed and firm and patient and quick to laugh, which turned out to be a combination that held even the most difficult students' attention. On the evenings, she came home. She rode into the yard, and Wyatt came out of whatever he was doing, because he had developed the habit of knowing the sound of that horse on the road at that hour, and they ate dinner at the kitchen table, where they'd first spread the documents that had nearly consumed her life, and they talked about the school and the ranch and the 1,000 ordinary things that constitute a shared existence. Patricia Harmon had indeed organized something, a gathering in Mill Creek the previous October. Nominally a harvest celebration, but actually a community expression of what the Valley thought about the Whitmore case and its resolution. Wyatt had stood in a room full of people being sociable for 3 hours straight, which was approximately 2.5 hours longer than his natural limit, and he had done it without complaint because Clara was beside him the entire time, and that made every room a different size than it would otherwise be. Tom Elder told anyone who would listen that he'd known how this was going to go the first time he saw the two of them in Wyatt's yard together. His wife told him to stop taking credit for things he merely observed. This conversation had happened approximately 9 times and showed no sign of resolving. Henry Caldwell's case was moving through the federal system with the slow, grinding certainty of something that had been properly built and would eventually arrive where it was going. Hardcastle wrote every 2 months with updates. The outcome was not in doubt. It was only a matter of time. Margaret Estes had her land. Clara had her father's land. Both properties were being worked by people who had a right to work them. One evening in the early spring, when the time in the garden was coming back for the 2nd year running, and the light lasted long enough to work after supper. If you had something to do, Clara found Wyatt standing at the front door, the same door where everything had started. The door he'd stood at 11 years of evenings without anyone on the other side of it. He was just standing there, not doing anything in particular, looking at where the road came over the rise and down toward the ranch. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. He turned around. He looked at her in the doorway, his wife, because that was what she was now had been since the previous November, in a ceremony attended by 43 people, including every child in the Mill Creek schoolhouse and Tom Elder, who had cried without admitting it, and he thought about a rule he'd made 11 years ago and what it had actually been doing all that time. "Do you know what I told myself?" he said, "when I made the rule about strangers?" "No. I told myself it was practical, sensible. A man living alone at the end of a mountain road couldn't be opening his door to every person who came by." He looked at the door, then back at her. "But the truth was simpler than that. I made the rule because I didn't trust myself to let someone in without wanting them to stay. And wanting someone to stay felt too close to something I'd already lost." Clara looked at him steadily. "You were protecting yourself," she said. "I was protecting myself," he said. "And the rule worked. For 11 years it worked perfectly. Nothing got in. Nothing was risked. Nothing was lost." He paused. "And nothing was lived." She crossed the porch and stood beside him at the door. She looked at the road too for a moment. The road that had brought her here in the rain with an envelope of evidence under her arm and nowhere left to run, and 4 words that had been the truest thing she'd ever said in her life. "The rule is broken," she said. "Has been since the night you knocked," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. Outside, the Colorado mountain evening was doing what it always did, enormous and indifferent and beautiful, in a way that asked nothing of you and gave everything to anyone willing to stand in it long enough to feel it. The time in the garden was taking care of itself. Patience was in the barn being proprietary about her stall. Tom Elder would probably appear on the road by Saturday because he always did. Wyatt took her hand. She took his back the way you take something you intend to keep. And that was the true end of the rule. Not the night he stepped aside to let a stranger in from the rain, though it had started there. Not the morning he rode to a judge before the bridge was repaired. Not the fence line conversation or the fire in the dark or the federal courthouse in Denver. The true end of the rule was this: a man and a woman standing in a doorway that had once been the loneliest door on the mountain, holding on to each other with the easy certainty of people who have stopped pretending they can do without the other, watching the evening come in over the ridge. The cowboy, who had spent 11 years keeping the world at arm's length, had finally let someone close enough to remind him what the arms were for. And he never made that mistake again. The mistake of calling emptiness safety, of calling solitude strength, of standing at a door and believing that a closed hand was the same thing as a protected heart. The door was open. It stayed open. And Wyatt Dawson, the man the valley had once called its most disagreeable rancher, became the man everyone knew as the one who had found in a single storm-soaked night, in a single act of stepping aside, the kind of life that most men spend their whole lives building walls to deserve.